This is Chapter 7 of Twilight. Chapter 7 is titled Nightmare, which is Chapter 6 was Scary Stories, so I guess they were that scary.
Jacob did scare me.
Jacob terrified her. Jacob, the 14-year-old succulent baby boy.
He's 15.
Oh, yeah. He just turned 15. And they made sure to remind us of that 1,000 times. Alright. I told Charlie I had a lot of homework to do, and that I didn't want anything to eat. There was a basketball game on that he was excited about, though of course I had no idea what was so special about it. So he wasn't aware of anything unusual in my face or tone. Once in my room, I locked the door. I dug through my desk until I found my old headphones, and I plugged them into my little CD player. I picked up a CD that Phil had given me for Christmas. It was one of his favorite bands, but they used a little too much bass and shrieking for my tastes. Like, what is it? I popped it into place and lay down on my bed. I put on the headphones, hit play, and turned up the volume until it hurt my ears. I closed my eyes, but the light still intruded, so I added a pillow over the top half of my face. I concentrated very carefully on the music, trying to understand the lyrics to unravel the complicated drum patterns. By the third time I'd listened through the entire CD, I knew all the words to the choruses, at least. I was surprised to find that I really did like the band after all. Once I got past the blaring noise, I'd have to thank Phil again. And it worked. The shattering beats made it impossible for me to think. Which was, I guess it's just some sort of dad rock metal. I don't know. She'll list off car names all day. She'll list off classical music all day, but it comes to one rock music and she's like, that one CD. I listened to the CD again and again until I was singing along with the songs, until finally I fell asleep. I opened my eyes to a familiar place, aware in some corner of my consciousness that I was dreaming. I recognized the green light of the forest. I could hear the waves crashing against the rocks somewhat nearby, and I knew that if I found the ocean, I'd be able to see the sun. I was trying to follow the sound, but then Jacob Black was there, tugging on my hand, pulling me back towards the blackest part of the forest. She meets a boy one time.
Yeah, and then she has a fucking dream about him.
Jacob, what's wrong? I asked. His face was frightened as he yanked with all of his strength against my resistance. I didn't want to go into the dark. Run, Bella. You have to run, he whispered, terrified. Oh, I forgot he has a voice.
Oh, you have a country voice.
Yeah, run, Bella. You have to run, he whispered, terrified. This way, Bella. I recognized Mike's voice calling out of the gloomy heart of the trees. But I couldn't see him. Mike has a flapjack voice.
He is a flapjack boy.
Why? I asked, still pulling against Jacob's grasp, desperate now to find the sun. But Jacob let go of my hand and yelped. Suddenly shaking, falling to the dim forest floor, he twitched on the ground as I watched him in horror. Jacob! I screamed, but he was gone. In his place was a large red-brown wolf with black eyes. The wolf faced away from me, pointing towards the shore, the hair on the back of his shoulders bristling, low growls issuing from between his exposed fangs. Bella, run! Mike cried out again from behind me, but I didn't turn. I was watching a light coming towards me from the beach. And then Edward stepped out from the trees, his skin faintly glowing, his eyes black and dangerous. He held up one hand and beckoned me to come with him. The wolf growled at my feet. I took a step forward towards Edwards. He smiled then, and his teeth were sharp, pointed. Trust me, he purred. I took another step. The wolf launched himself across the space between me and the vampire, fangs aiming for the jugular. No! I screamed, wrenching upright out of my bed. My sudden movement caused the headphones to pull off the CD player, off of the bedside table, and it clattered on the wooden floor. My light was still on, and I was sitting fully dressed on the bed with my shoes on. I glanced, disoriented, at the clock on my dresser. It was 5:30 in the morning.
So, two things from that dream.
Yeah.
It sounds like Bella's power when she becomes a vampire should just be, like, future sight, like Alice.
Yeah. Hermit purple.
And also, Mike has a chance. Because
yeah,
he's right in
Mike's
there
in
with
the dream
singers.
out of everyone else. Well, she's always like, I like Mike. Never mind, I hate him. I groaned, fell back, and rolled over onto my face.
He was a monster boy.
I kicked off my boots, but I was too uncomfortable to get anywhere near sleep. I rolled back over and unbuttoned my jeans, yanking them off awkwardly as I tried to stay horizontal. I could feel the braid in my hair, an uncomfortable ridge along the back of my skull. I turned onto my side and ripped the rubber band out, quickly combing through the plates with my fingers. I pulled the pillow back over my eyes. It was all no use, of course. My subconscious had dredged up exactly the images I'd been trying so desperately to avoid. I was going to have to face them now. I sat up and my head spun for a minute as the blood flowed downwards. First things first, I thought to myself, happy to put it off as long as possible. I grabbed my bathroom bag. The shower didn't last nearly as long as I hoped it would. Well, it's up to you, Bella.
You don't have to get out if you're not done.
Even taking the time to blow dry my hair, I was soon out of things to do in the bathroom. Wrapped in a towel, I crossed back to my room. I couldn't tell if Charlie was still asleep or if he had already left. I went to look outside my window, and the cruiser was gone. Fishing again. I dressed slowly in my most comfy sweats, and then made my bed, something I never did. I couldn't put it off any longer. I went to my desk and switched on to my old computer. I hated using the internet. My modem was sadly outdated, my free service substandard. Just dialing up took so long that I decided to go get myself a bowl of cereal while I waited. I ate slowly, chewing each bite with care. When I was done, I washed the bowl and spoon, dried them, and put them away. My feet dragged as I climbed the stairs. I went to my CD player first, picking it up off the floor and placing it precisely in the center of the table. I pulled out the headphones and put them away in the desk drawer. Then I turned on the CD, turning it down to a point where it was background noise. Man, you could have just taken out all of that.
Yeah.
Just the last two paragraphs could have just taken them out.
She could have just been like, I ate breakfast and I put on some music.
Yeah, like, Jesus. With another sigh, I turned to my computer. Naturally, the screen was covered in pop-up ads. I sat in my hard... Apparently she was looking up porn and got a lot of viruses. Eventually I made it to my favorite search engine. What is it, Bella? What's your favorite search engine? It's probably Ask Jeeves, because fucking Stephanie Meyer's a boomer.
Yeah.
I shot down a few more pop-ups and then typed in one word. Vampire. It took an infuriatingly long time, of course.
No, it wouldn't.
When the results came up, there was a lot of stuff to sift through. Everything from movies and TV shows to role-playing games, underground metal, and gothic cosmetic companies. Then I found a promising site. Vampires A to Z. I waited patiently for it to load, quickly clicking close to each ad that flashed across the screen. You need a virus protector, Bella. Finally, the screen was finished. Simple white background with black text. It was academic looking. 2 quotes greeted me on the homepage. Throughout the vast, shadowy world of ghosts and demons, there is no figure so terrible, no figure so dreaded and abhorred, yet blight with such fearful fascination, as the vampire, who is himself neither ghost nor demon, but yet who partakes the dark natures and possesses the mysterious and terrible qualities of both. Reverend Montague Summers. And then a second quote. If there is in this world a well-attested account, it is that of the vampires. Nothing is lacking, official reports. Affidavits of well-known people, of surgeons, of priests, of magistrates. The judicial proof is most complete. And with all that, who is there to believe in vampires? The rest of the site was alphabetized, listing all the different myths of vampires held throughout the world. The first I clicked on, the Dinaj, was a Filipino vampire supposedly responsible for planting taro on the islands long ago. The myth continued that the Dinog worked with humans for many years, but the partnership ended one day when a woman cut her finger, and the Dinog sucked her wound, enjoying the taste so much that it drained her body completely of blood. I read carefully through the descriptions, looking for anything that sounded familiar, let alone plausible. It seemed that most vampire myths centered around beautiful women as demons and children as victims. They also seemed like constructs created to explain the high mortality rates for young children, and to give men an excuse for infidelity. You know, men.
I don't think I've ever heard.
No, I'm pretty sure none of that's true.
It's usually like men seducing young women.
Yeah. There wasn't much that sounded like the movies I'd seen, and only very few, like the Hebrew Estri and the Polish Upier, who were even preoccupied with drinking blood. Only 3 entries really caught my attention. The Romanian Varacolasi, which I'm sure I butchered, a powerful undead being who could appear as beautiful, pale-skinned human. The Slavic Nalepsi, a creature so strong and fast it could massacre an entire village in a single hour after midnight. And one other, the Strigoni Benefushi. About this last there was only one brief sentence. Strigoni Benefushi, an Italian vampire said to be on the side of goodness, an immortal enemy of all the evil vampires. It was a relief that one small entry, the one myth among hundreds that claimed the existence of good vampires. Overall, though, there was little that coincided with Jacob's story or my own observations. I made a little catalog in my mind as I read and carefully compared it with each myth. Speed, strength, beauty, pale skin, eyes that shift colors, and then Jacob's criteria: blood drinkers, enemy of the werewolf, cold skin, and immortal. There were very few myths that matched even one factor. And then another problem, one that I remembered from the small number of scary movies I'd seen, and was backed up by today's reading. Vampires couldn't come out in the daytime. The sun would burn them to a cinder. They slept in coffins all day and came out only at night. It was I, Dio Brando. It's just completely ruined vampires for me.
Where's the part where they shoot lasers?
Where's the laser eyes? Aggravated, same. I snapped off the computer's main power switch, not waiting to shut down things properly. This is why it's broken, Bella. This is why your computer doesn't work. Through my irritation, I felt overwhelming embarrassment. It was all so stupid. I was sitting in my room researching vampires. What was wrong with me? I decided that most of the blame belonged on the doorstep of the town of Forks, and the entire sodden Olympic Peninsula for that matter. I had to get out of the house, but there was nowhere I wanted to go that didn't involve a 3-day drive. I pulled on my boots anyway, unclear of where I was headed, and went downstairs. I shrugged into my raincoat without checking the weather and stomped out the door. She's so pissed. It was overcast but not raining yet. I ignored my truck and started east on foot, angling across Charlie's yard towards the ever-encroaching forest. It didn't take long till I was deep enough for the house and the road to be invisible, but for only the sound of the squish of damp earth under my feet and the sudden cries of the jays. There was a thin ribbon of a trail that led through the forest here, or I wouldn't risk wandering my own like this. My sense of direction was hopeless. I could get lost in much less helpful surroundings. The trail wound deeper and deeper into the forest, mostly east, as far as I could tell. It snaked around the Sitka spruces and the hemlocks and the yews and the maples. I only vaguely knew the names of the trees around me, and all I knew was due to Charlie pointing them out to me from the cruiser window in earlier days.
So randomly detailed.
Yeah, I don't... It's like she learned something that day and was like, oh, I'll put that in my story. There were many I didn't know, and others I couldn't be sure about because they were covered in green parasites. I followed the trail as long as my anger at myself pushed me forward. As that started to ebb, I slowed. A few drops of moisture trickled down from the canopy above me, but I couldn't be certain if it was beginning to rain or if it was simply pools left over from yesterday, held high in the leaves above me, slowly dripping their way down to the earth. A recently fallen tree, I knew it was recent because it was entirely carpeted in moss, rested against the truck of one of her sisters, creating a sheltered little bench just a few feet safe off the trail. I stepped over the ferns and sat carefully, making sure my jacket was between the damp seat and my clothes wherever they touched, and I leaned my hooded head back against the living tree. It's like she just wanted the book to be long.
Yeah. If it's long, it's more impressive.
I guess. Like, damn, this really could have been like 280 pages instead of 485. This was the wrong place to have come. I should have known, but where else was there to go? The forest was deep green and far too much like the scene in last night's dream to allow a true peace of mind. Now that there was no longer the sound of my soggy footsteps, the silence was piercing. The birds were quiet too, the drops increasing in frequency, so it must be raining above. The ferns stood higher than my head now that I was seated, and I knew someone could walk by on the path 3 feet away and not see me.
What fucking fun.
They're prehistoric ferns. Here in the trees, it was much easier to believe the absurdities that embarrassed me indoors. Nothing had changed in this forest for thousands of years, and all the myths and legends of 100 different lands seemed much more likely in this green haze than they had in my clear-cut bedroom. I forced myself to focus on the two most vital questions I had to answer, but I did so unwillingly. First, I had to decide if it was possible that what Jacob had said about the Cullens could be true. Immediately, my mind responded with a resounding negative. It was silly. and morbid to entertain such ridiculous notions. But what then? I asked myself. There was no rational explanation for how I was alive at this moment. I listed again in my head the things I had observed myself. The impossible speed and strength, the eye color shifting from black to gold and back again, the inhuman beauty. He's too hot to be human. The pale, frigid skin, and more. Small things that registered slowly. How they never seemed to eat. The disturbing grace with which they moved. And the way he sometimes spoke, with unfamiliar cadences and phrases.
I just don't think I've ever looked at any person and been like, they are inhumanly attractive.
Inhumanly beautiful.
It's like,
so hot that I'm like, you're not a person.
I just don't think there exists such a combination of features.
Yeah. Well, you know, Edward, I guess. Robert Pattinson. He had skipped class the day we'd done blood typing. He hadn't said no to the beach trip till he heard where we were going. He seemed to know what everyone around him was thinking, except for me. He had told me he was the villain, that he was dangerous. Could the Cullens be vampires?
Probably not.
Well, they were something. Something outside the possibility of a rational justification was taking place in front of my own credulous eyes. Whether it be Jacob's cold ones, or my own superhero theory, Edward Cullen was not human. He was something more. So then, maybe, that would have to be my answer for now. And then the most important question of all. What was I going to do if any of it was true? If Edward was a vampire, I could hardly make myself think the words. Then what should I do? Involving someone else was definitely out. I couldn't even believe myself. Anyone I told would have me committed. Only two options seemed practical. The first was to take his advice, to be smart, to avoid him as much as possible, to cancel our plans, to go back to ignoring him as far as I was able, to pretend there was an impenetrable thick glass wall between us in one class where we were forced together, to tell him to leave me alone and mean it this time. But I was gripped in a sudden agony of despair as I considered that alternative.
Over this guy you've known for like 3 days?
It's been like a week. My mind rejected the pain, quickly skipping on to the next option. I could do nothing different. After all, if he was something sinister, he'd done nothing to hurt me so far. In fact, I could be a dent in Tyler's fender if he hadn't acted so quickly. So quickly, I argued with myself, that it might have been sheer reflexes. But if it was a reflex to save lives, then how bad could he be? My head spun in the answerless circles. There was one thing I was sure of, if I was sure of anything. That dark Edward in my dream last night was a reflection only of my fear of the word that Jacob had spoken, and not Edward himself. Even so, when I screamed out in terror at the werewolf's lunge, it wasn't fear for the wolf that brought the cry of no to my lips. It was the fear that he would be harmed. Even as he called to me with sharp-edged fangs, I feared for him. And I knew that was my answer. I didn't know if there was ever a choice, really. I was already in too deep. Now that I knew, if I knew, I could do nothing about my frightening secret. Because when I thought of him, of his voice, his hypnotic eyes, the magnetic force of his personality, I wanted nothing more than to be with him right now. But I couldn't think it. Not here alone in the darkening forest. Not while the rain made it as dim as twilight under the canopy and pattered like footsteps across the matted earthen floor. I shivered and rose quickly from my place of concealment, worried that somehow the path would have disappeared from the rain. But it was there, safe and clear, winding its way out of the dripping green maze. I followed it hastily, my hood pulled close around my face, becoming surprised as I nearly ran through the trees at how far I had come. I started to wonder if I was heading out at all, or if I was following the path further into the confines of the forest. Before I could get too panicky, though, I began to glimpse some open spaces in the webbed branches, and then I could hear a car passing on the street, and I was free. She went, down a one direct path, and was like, am I lost?
And, there are entire blogs dedicated to how terrible and abusive Edward is, but nobody ever talks about how obsessed Bella is. She's a freak.
It's almost like Bella's more of the problem.
Yeah.
Charlie's lawn stretched out in front of me, the house beckoning me, promising warmth and dry socks. It was just noon when I got back inside. I went upstairs and got dressed for the day. Jeans and a t-shirt. since I was staying indoors. It didn't take too much effort to concentrate on my task for the day. A paper on Macbeth that was due Wednesday.
Oh, she was reading it for fun.
She was reading it for fun because she'd probably already read it before and already had it totally memorized. I settled into outlining a rough draft contentedly, more serene than I'd felt since Thursday afternoon, if I was being honest. That had always been my way, though. Making decisions was the painful part for me, the part I agonized over. But once the decision was made, I simply followed through, usually with relief that the choice was made. Sometimes the relief was tainted by despair, like my decision to come with forks. But it was still better than wrestling with the alternatives. This decision was ridiculously easy to live with. Dangerously easy.
That whole paragraph is like Bella being like, yes, I am a human, and I experience emotions.
Yeah, like, again, we could have just taken that whole thing and just not had it.
She could have been like, it was much easier to focus on my essay now that I had come to a decision.
And so the day was quiet, productive. I finished my paper before 8. Charlie came home with a large catch, and I made a mental note to pick up a book of recipes for fish while I was in Seattle next week. I slept dreamlessly that night, exhausted from beginning my day so early and sleeping so poorly the night before. I woke for the second time since arriving in Forks to the bright yellow light of a sunny day. I skipped to the window, stunned to see that there was hardly a cloud in the sky, and those there were just fleecy little white puffs that couldn't possibly be carrying rain. I opened the window, surprised when it opened silently without sticking, not having opened it in who knows how many years.
Edward greased it so he could
He lubed up the windows. And I sucked in the relatively dry air. It was nearly warm and hardly windy at all. My blood was electric. Charlie was finishing breakfast when I came downstairs, and he picked up on my mood immediately. "Nice day out," he commented. "Yes," I agreed with a grin. He smiled back, his brown eyes crinkling around the edges. When Charlie smiled, it was easier to see why he and my mother had jumped too quickly into an early marriage.
Oh.
Gross.
You say your dad's hot?
Most of the young romantic he'd been in those days had faded before I'd known him, as the curly brown hair, in the same color, if not the same texture as mine, had dwindled slowly, revealing more and more of the shiny, skinny forehead on his head. But when he smiled, I could see a little of the man who'd run away with Renee when she was just 2 years older than I was now.
Charlie's not romantic as he keeps all the mementos and memories of his marriage.
I ate breakfast cheerily, watching the dust motes stirring in the sunlight that streamed into the back window. Charlie called out a goodbye, and I heard the cruiser pull away from the house. I hesitated on my way out the door, hand on my rain jacket. It would be tempting fate to leave it at home. With a sigh, I folded over my arm and stepped out into the brightest light that I'd seen in months. By dint of a much elbow grease, I was able to get both the windows of my truck almost completely rolled down. I was one of the first ones at school. I hadn't even checked the clock into a hurry to get inside. I parked and headed towards the seldom-used picnic benches on the south side of the cafeteria. The benches were still a little damp, so I sat on my jacket, glad to have a use for it. My homework was done, the product of a slow social life, but there was a few trig problems I wasn't sure that I had right. I took my book industriously out, but halfway through rechecking the first problem, I was daydreaming. Watching the sunlight play on the red-barked trees, I sketched inattentively along the margins of my homework. After a few minutes, I suddenly realized I'd drawn 5 pairs of dark eyes staring out at the page at me. I scrubbed them out with an eraser. "Bella," I heard someone call, and it sounded like Mike. I looked around to realize that the school had begun populated while I was sitting there absent-minded. Everyone was in t-shirts, some even in shorts, though the temperature couldn't be over 60. Mike was coming towards me in khaki shorts and a striped rugby shirt. "Hey, Mike," I called, waving back, unable to be half-hearted on a morning like this. "Hey, Mike." He came to sit by me, the tidy spikes of his hair shining golden in the light, his grin stretching across his face. He was so delighted to see me, I couldn't help but feel gratified. "I never noticed before. Your hair has red in it," he commented, catching between his fingers a strand that was fluttering in the light breeze. "Only in the sun." I became just a little uncomfortable as he tucked the lock behind my ear. "Great day, isn't it?" "My kind of day," I agreed. "What is this?"
That was the word. She would have creamed her pants.
Yeah.
And it's small talk.
Yeah. This whole chapter is small talk.
Well, you can't get anything else out of Bella. because she's like, it's fine, I'm okay, great.
Bye. My kind of day.
So monosyllabic, it's annoying.
What'd you do yesterday? His tone was just a bit too a properity. I mostly worked on my essay. I didn't add that I was finished with it. No need to sound smug. He hit his forehead with the heel of his hand. Oh, yeah. That was due Thursday, right? Wednesday, I think. Wednesday? He frowned. That's not good. What are you writing yours on? Whether Shakespeare's treatment of the female characters is misogynistic. Stephanie Meyer.
And he's like, yeah, well, you gotta throw that song. Bella's whole life is literally fucking screeching over Edward and deciding whether she wants to be noodle buddies with him or not.
He stared at me like I'd spoken in pig Latin. I guess I'll have to get to work on that tonight, he said.
Her mom straight up abandoned her for a man.
I was going to ask if you wanted to go out. Oh, I was taken off guard. Why couldn't I ever have a pleasant conversation with Mike without it getting awkward?
It's not awkward. He's inviting you to hang out.
We could go to dinner or something, and I could work on it later. He smiled at me hopefully. Mike. I hated being put on the spot. I don't think that's the best idea. Why? He asked, his eyes guarded. My thoughts flickered to Edward, wondering if that's where his thoughts were as well. I think, and if you ever repeat what I'm saying right now, I'll cheerfully beat you to death. But I think that would hurt Jessica's feelings. He was bewildered. Jessica? Really, Mike? Are you blind? Oh. He exhaled, clearly dazed. I took advantage of that to make my escape. It's time for class. I can't be late again. I gathered up my books and stuffed them in my bag. We walked in silence to Building 3, and his expression was distracted. I hope whatever thoughts he was immersed in were leading him right in the right direction.
He's not
when I saw
to like run his life on how Jessica would
Yeah.
feel.
We walked in silence to Building 3, and his expression was distracted. When I saw Jessica intrigued, she was bubbling with enthusiasm. Bumbling. She, Angel, and Lauren were going to Port Angeles tonight to go dress shopping for the dance, and she wanted me to come too, even though I didn't need one. I was indecisive. It'd be nice to get out of town with some girlfriends, but Lauren would be there, and who knew what I could be doing tonight. Huh. But that was definitely the wrong path to let my mind wander down. Of course I was happy about the sunlight, but that wasn't completely responsible for the euphoric mood I was in. Not even close. So I gave her a maybe, telling her I'd have to talk with Charlie. She talked of nothing but the dance on the way to Spanish, continuing as if without interruption when class finally ended 5 minutes late, and we were on our way to lunch. I was far too lost in my own frenzy of anticipation to notice much of what she said. I was painfully eager to see not just him, but all of the Collins.
Stare at Edward again.
To compare them with the new suspicions that plagued my mind.
That's why.
As I crossed the threshold of the cafeteria, I felt the first true tingle of fear slither down my spine and settle in my stomach. Would they be able to know what I was thinking? And then a different feeling jolted through me. Would Edward be waiting to sit with me again? As was my routine, I glanced first towards the Collins table. A shiver of panic trembled down my stomach as I realized it was empty. With dwindling hope, my eyes scoured the rest of the cafeteria, hoping to find him alone.
Of course they won't be here if they're vampires.
Yeah, she really didn't put that together. The place was nearly filled. Spanish had made us late, but there was no sign of Edward or any of his family. Desolation hit me with crippling strength. She's just ruined.
She spent like hours reading about vampires. It wasn't like, oh right,
the sun. We were late enough that everyone was already at our table. I avoided the empty chair next to Mike in favor of one by Angela. I vaguely noticed that Mike held the chair out politely for Jessica, and that her face lit up in a response. Angela asked a few quiet questions about Macbeth, which I answered as naturally as I could, while spiraling downward in misery. She too invited me to go with them tonight, and I agreed now, grasping at anything to distract myself. I realized I'd been holding on to the last shred of hope when I entered biology, saw his empty seat, and felt a new wave of disappointment. Which left me little in the way of distractions. I had fish marinating for dinner, with a salad and bread. No, wait, I lost my spot. That is not correct.
We
just jumped all over it. Okay. The rest of the day passed slowly, dismally. In gym, we had a lecture on the rules of badminton, the next torture they had lined up for me. But at least it meant I got to sit, and listen instead of stumbling around on the court. I was glad to leave campus so I would be free to pout and mope before I went out tonight with Jessica and company. But right after I walked out the door of Charlie's house, Jessica called to cancel our plans. I tried to be happy that Mike had asked her out to dinner. I really was relieved that he finally seemed to be catching on. But my enthusiasm sounded false in my own ears. She rescheduled our shopping trip for tomorrow night, which left me little in the way of distractions. I had fish marinating for dinner with a salad and bread left over from last night, so there was nothing to do there. I spent a focused half hour on homework, but then I was through that too. I checked my email, reading the backlog of letters from my mother. Yeah, like, I swear to God, like, they don't have TVs, they don't have video games. I saw the letters from my mom, and I sighed and typed a quick response. Mom, sorry I've been out. Went to the beach with friends. Had to write a paper. My excuses were fairly pathetic, so I gave up on that. It's sunny outside today. I know, I'm shocked. So I'm gonna go outside and soak up some vitamin D. Love you, Bella. I decided to kill an hour with non-school related reading. I had a small collection of books that came with me to Forks. The shabbiest volume being a compilation of the works of Jane Austen, of course. I selected that one and headed to the backyard, grabbing a ragged old quilt from the linen cupboard at the top of the stairs on my way down. Outside in Charlie's small square yard, I folded the quilt in half and laid it out on the reach of the tree's shadows, under the thick lawn that would always be slightly wet no matter how long the sun shone. I lay on my stomach, crossing my ankles in the air, flipping through the different novels in the book, trying to decide which would occupy my mind the most thoroughly. My favorites, of course, were Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility. I've read the first one recently, so I started into Sense and Sensibility, only to remember that I began chapter 3, that the hero of the story happened to be named Edward. Angrily, I turned to Mansfield Park. But the hero of that piece was named Edmund, and that was just too close. Weren't there any other names available in the late 18th century?
Why don't you read about Mr. Darcy?
I snapped my book shut. Why don't you read a book that's not the same book that every girl ever is like, I'm a reader, and it's just these 3 titles.
Yeah.
I pushed my sleeves up as high as they would go and closed my eyes.
Read some manga, you won't run into Edward there.
I would think of nothing but the warmth on my skin, I told myself severely. The breeze was still light, but it blew tendrils of my hair around my face, and that tickled. I pulled my hair over my head, letting it fan out on the quilt above me, and I focused again on the heat that touched my eyelids, my cheekbones, my nose, my lips, my forearms, my neck, soaking through my light shirt. She is the opposite of a vampire. She gets off to the sun. The next thing I was conscious of was the sound of Charlie's cruise turning into the bricks of the driveway. Like, Bella, what the fuck are you doing? Put your clothes on.
Get inside!
Get inside! Charlie, I asked, but I could hear his door slamming in front of the house. I jumped up, foolishly edgy, gathering the now damped quilt in my book. Ew. I ran inside to... Like, I know it's damp because of the lawn, but you can't follow up the ecstasy. Ugh. No, she juiced the quilt. I cannot read.
It says I like rocks.
Oh, yeah, I like rocks. I jumped up, foolishly edgy. Charlie was hanging up his gun belt and stepping into his boots when I came in. Sorry, Dad, dinner's not ready yet. I fell asleep outside. Don't worry about it. I wanted to catch the score on the game anyway. I watched TV with Charlie after dinner, for something to do. There wasn't anything on that I wanted to watch, but he knew I didn't like baseball, so he turned it to some mindless sitcom that neither of us enjoyed. He seemed happy, though, to be doing something together, and it felt good, despite my depression, to make him happy. Dad, I said during a commercial, Jessica and Angela are going to go look at dresses for dance tomorrow night in Port Angeles. They wanted me to help them choose. Do you mind if I go with them? Jessica Stanley? He asked. And Angela Weber? I sighed as I gave him the details. He was confused. But you're not going to the dance, right? No, Dad, but I'm helping them find dresses. You know, giving them constructive criticism. I wouldn't have had to explain this to a woman. Well, okay. He seemed to realize that he was out of his depth with the girly stuff. It's a school night, though. We'll leave right after school so we can get back early. You'll be okay for dinner, right? Bells, I fed myself for 17 years before you got here, he reminded me. I don't know how you survived, I muttered, then added more clearly. I'll leave some things out for cold-cut sandwiches in the fridge, right on top.
You a bitch to your dad.
She just went over and was like, oh yeah, my dad loved me so much, he didn't even watch the game he wanted to. It was sunny again in the morning. I awakened with renewed hope that I grimly tried to suppress. I dressed for the warmer weather in a deep blue V-neck blouse, something I'd worn in the dead of winter in Phoenix. I'd planned my arrival at school so that I barely had time to make it in class. With a sinking heart, I circled the full lot looking for a space, while also searching for the silver Volvo that was clearly not there. I parked in the last row and hurried to English, arriving breathless but subdued before the final bell. It was the same as yesterday. I just couldn't keep little sprouts of hope from budding in my mind, only to have them squashed painfully as I searched the lunchroom in vain and sat at the empty biology table. The Port Angeles scheme was back on again for tonight, and made all the more attractive by the fact that Lauren had other obligations. Fuck Lauren. I was anxious to get out of town so I could stop glancing over my shoulder.
They didn't even put her in the movie. They like, we don't need that.
They really did. They just took her whole ass character out. I was anxious to get to town so I could stop glancing over my shoulder and hoping he would appear somewhere. I vowed to myself that I'd be in a good mood tonight and not ruin Angel and Jessica's enjoyment in the dress hunting. Maybe I could do a little clothes shopping as well. I refused to think that I might be shopping alone in Seattle this weekend, no longer interested in the earlier arrangement. Surely he wouldn't cancel without at least telling me. After school, Jessica followed me home in her old white truck, Mercury, so that I could ditch my books and truck, and I brushed off through my hair quickly when I was inside, feeling a slight lift of excitement as I contemplated getting out of Forks. I left a note for Charlie on the table explaining again where to find dinner, switched my scruffy wallet from my school bag to a purse I rarely used, and I ran out to join Jessica. We went to Angela's house next, and she was waiting for us. My excitement increased exponentially as we actually drove out of the town limits.
I took something less safe for some reason.
Yeah, and that actually is the end of Chapter 7. I did not know that was the... That is the end of Chapter 7. Bye!